Thank you so much to everyone for coming. This is the final panel. We're going to discuss why the debate that was at issue in Edwards versus Aguilar, or some aspect of it, still matters. And most of the folks on this panel we've already been introduced to before. Ron Numbers, Michael Ruse, Eugenie Scott. And I want to introduce briefly Michael McConnell and Hank Greely, who will be joining us. I've asked the speakers to keep their thoughts relatively casual and somewhat brief, partly because we want to hear from you as much as possible and from the other people who've already participated. So we're going to keep this a little off the cuff and move forward quickly. Michael McConnell is the Richard and Frances Mallory Professor of Law here at Stanford Law School. He, before joining the law school a couple of years ago, he was a judge on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. He's a leading authority on constitutional law, jurisprudence, and law and religion. Hank Greely is the Dean F. and Kate Edelman Johnson Professor of Law here at Stanford Law School. He specializes in ethical, legal, and social issues arising from advances in the biosciences. Among other things, he chairs the California Advisory Committee on Human Stem Cell Research and the Steering Committee of the Stanford University Center for Biomedical Ethics, and directs the Stanford Center for Law and the Biosciences. So, I'm going to get out of the way. Your turn.
Oh. I've been encouraged to say something in my few minutes about the globalization of creationism or anti-evolutionism, which makes what we've been talking about all day quite important, I think. Back at the time of Edwards versus Aguilar, the leading observers, people like Stephen Gould, would assure other areas of the world that this was a distinctive American bizarrity, and they didn't have to worry about it at all. And even down to the present, some Americans take comfort from the fact that at least it isn't going around the rest of the world. Well, I don't want to upset anybody right now, but that's no longer true. For example, last November, I attended a conference in Ghent, Belgium, where there were about 15 historians of science from all across Europe. And every one of them was talking about the creationist threat that is already present. This book will come out shortly from Johns Hopkins. And across Europe, which is probably still the least creationist part of the globe, there's been considerable activity. Some of you may have seen a BBC poll not too long ago that the majority of Charles Darwin's countrymen don't believe in evolution. A few years ago, the Minister of Education in the Netherlands proposed that intelligent design should be taught in the public schools of the Netherlands because Christians, Jews, and Muslims could all agree, and they were seeking for peace. It spread to the eastern part of Europe. One of the interesting stories comes out of Russia and other countries in the former USSR. With the fall of the Soviet Union, creationists rushed in. Many of them were Pentecostals initially, Russian Pentecostals. In the Ministry of Education, you had senior people inviting Henry Morse, you've heard about him this morning, and others from the Institute for Creation Research to come in and help with curricular materials and help write textbooks for the Russians. And interesting argument, some here might actually feel it was a good one, is that they pointed out that for decades, one dogma had prevailed in the teaching of biology in the Soviet Union, and now that they were free, they should have the chance to choose. In Greece, I mean, we typically don't think of the Orthodox churches being very involved in this. We had a very good paper on the Greek Orthodox Church, which is quite strongly against the teaching of evolution. As early as the 1980s, outposts of creationism were appearing, especially very early on in Australia, which became probably the second most active region in the world, and South Korea. Probably per capita, there are more young earth creationists in South Korea than any other place. And for years, they've been sending out creationist missionaries trying to save the Canadians. They go to the west coast of Canada. They have an institute there. And they send creation missionaries to Indonesia to try to bring the truth to those people. Which leads to Muslims. Probably the biggest region in the world to take up creation science with great enthusiasm has been the Middle East and the Muslim world. Sort of the epicenter there is in Istanbul, Turkey, where a charismatic man trained as an interior designer, and then he did a little philosophy too. Yeah. Never got a university degree. Has become an international guru. He has written 200 to 300 books. Maybe not all himself, but he claims he did. One of his, The Evolution Deceit, he claims is circulating in, I believe the last time, 7 or 8 million copies. It's been given out free with newspapers. It's been translated into every language where Muslims might be. Recently, that is a few years ago, he turned out this really impressive, huge book called The Atlas of Creation, which he sent to people all over the world. Highly illustrated. It must cost a couple $100 a volume for something like that. And he's having a great deal of influence. And if you count Turkey as part of Europe, Turkey is the leading country to reject evolution. And then for those of you who think that it could be limited to the Christians and the Muslims, about 2,000, some conservative Jews, I should be more precise, some Orthodox Jews, not technically conservative, organized the Torah Science Foundation, which attracts 1,000 or more to its annual conferences, primarily drawing on people in Israel and the United States. They insist that this is nothing like Christian fundamentalist creationism because they add a little Kabbalah in with their critique of evolution. So there is virtually no place in the world you might think, well, communist China is not going to do it. I was over there a few years ago and found the leading intelligent design books had been translated into Chinese, and I couldn't read. But I asked about this. I said, who's publishing this? I figured, well, some Christian missionaries are behind this. They said, oh, no, this is the Communist Party Press is the one bringing this out. I tried to figure out why they would have any interest, and the best answer I could get is that the party press wants Chinese to have access to what's being discussed in the rest of the world. These ideas being discussed, so Chinese should have their crack at that. Do I have any more minutes?
I think we're ready to, no, that's okay.
You're ready to go on?
I think we're ready to move on, yeah.
Well.
Do you think that was a secular purpose for that? Okay.
It's providential.
Maybe Brian.
Yeah.
Michael?
Of course, the big news this week has not been creationism. It's been the president finally coming out in favor of gay marriage. And, of course, a lot of people are opposed to this. And I'd make a pretty good bet that there's a fairly strong, significant statistical correlation between those who've applauded what the president has said, those who've opposed him, and those who believe in evolution, and those who don't. And I think one of the things that has come most strongly to me over the last, well, let's say the last 10 years, is the extent to which this isn't just a debate about gaps in the fossil record. By and large, perhaps with the exception of Henry Morris, I don't think the average anti-evolutionist lies awake worrying about the fossil record. I know that Philip Johnson has never done so. He doesn't. But it's very interesting to read, first of all, people like Henry Morris, and then people like Philip Johnson. And I'm always amazed, particularly in the case of Johnson, how quickly he wants to get away from evolution and into other issues. And pro-capital punishment, anti-gay, all of these sorts of things. One thing that Johnson is always going on about, and read Reason and the Balance if you don't believe me, is cross-dressing and the evils of cross-dressing. And in fact, he goes on about it so much. I mean, I thought to myself, you know, I really don't think, for all his faults, that Richard Dawkins comes home at the end of the day and says to Lala, to whom I gather he's married these days, Lala, it's been one hell of a day. Would you fix me a gin and tonic, and is my pink nightie back from the cleaners yet? In fact, I got to the stage where I wondered whether Johnson himself has got issues. You know, satin or something like that. I was talking about this a couple of years ago at Oxford.
And is making fun of Philip Johnson an argument?
Yeah. And I was talking about him a couple of years ago, and some woman put her hand up and said, "You've missed it completely. It's feminism that he's worried about." Hillary Clinton, stroppy broads in pantsuits. And you know, you look at Hillary Clinton this week as she strides out cheerily in her pantsuit. That's what they're worried about. And so I want to go a different direction from Ron. I mean, in other words, I want to go sort of vertically. He's gone horizontally, so we're not in any sense in conflict on this. I want to say that I see this whole movement as a much broader thing than just evolution, creation, and that's why I see a lot of differences, obviously, between creation science and intelligent design. I mean, for instance, Michael Behe strikes me as, you know, pretty much a theistic evolutionist. I don't think that Johnson was, but I mean, I think that what links all of these people, and Bill Dembski on one occasion said, you know, for all my differences with Henry Morris, I'm 99% with him. And I wondered about that, because I thought, you know, you're not. But of course he is, because they're absolutely convinced that modernism, to use, you know, in a general sense, is wrong, is evil. And I see this then as a much bigger fight. And I mean, it's interesting that already you've had to bring in global warming, but global warming is now one of the issues. And of course, clearly, this is also, we're also involved in this. I mean, the very idea that, you know, God made the earth for us. So don't worry, folks, it's going to be okay. Either he's going to find a solution or Armageddon is coming. But either way, you know, don't worry about it. So as I say, I don't see this just as gaps in the fossil record. I see this as a very much broader issue that I think we should, you know, devote all our energies to fighting.
Well, I interpreted the topic of this session, what does it matter, is specifically thinking of Edwards, and so my views are a little narrower than my predecessors here. But you know, the First Amendment is a really remarkable document. If you look at the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, they come together. It's a package deal. And taken together, that means that public institutions have to be religiously neutral. They can neither advance nor inhibit religion, which is, I think, a great idea, one of the real strengths of American society. What Edwards, to me, means is that this system works. The issue here with Edwards, with the equal time for creation science laws, became whether creation science is a scientific view or is a disguised religious view. If it is a disguised religious view, you cannot advocate it in the public school. The distinction being between teaching about religion and advocating religion. And creation science was declared properly as the advocacy of religion because it really is a specific sectarian religious view. It is biblical literalism, as we who've been studying this for a long time can easily provide you with evidence for. Similarly with intelligent design. Intelligent design is a sectarian religious view. One of the bits of evidence that we can show that these are sectarian religious views is that it doesn't take very long at all when one of these issues shows up in a local school board or a state legislature or in a bigger venue such as McLean or Edwards. The mainstream clergy lines up on my side. Catholics and mainstream Protestants don't want creation science to be taught because they recognize it as a sectarian religious position. Monday through Friday, kids are learning a different religious view, and then they've got to straighten them out on Saturday and Sunday. So that's why the plaintiffs in Michael's McLean versus Arkansas case were leaders of religious organizations. So the beauty of Edwards to me is the fact that the courts can recognize when even disguised religious advocacy is really religious advocacy and strike it down as being in violation of the neutrality toward religion required in the public schools. So I'm forever grateful to McLean and to Edwards for this. And I hope that, that more people can recognize that even if you call something science, that doesn't make it science. And the issue really boils down to what do you teach in a high school science class? Not what should everybody know about religion, what should everybody know about the various opinions that we can exchange about issues that are important to us as members of a heterogeneous society, but what do you teach in a high school science class? And what you should teach is science. This should not come as an amazing revelation to people. And if you should teach science, then religious views masquerading as science need to be identified for what they are. And I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Well, I agree with Professor Ruse that this is a larger issue than just the gaps in the record. And of course, there are clashes of worldview of which the disagreements about evolution are one small part. And that's why this is important, because much as we might all wish that all of our fellow citizens agreed with us, whichever side we may be on, they don't. In a diverse republic, we have many different views. And the question that I think this interesting controversy presents is how in a democratic and liberal republic in which we're committed to the proposition that government institutions like public schools cannot be used as an instrument of warfare in the culture wars and not as an instrument of indoctrination, how do we deal with these differences? And it seems to me that the controversy in Edwards against Aguillard is an object lesson in how we should not go about this. That virtually every actor in this unfortunate saga did a very bad job of of constructing policy for a diverse liberal republic, beginning with the educational profession teaching biology in the public schools prior to the enactment of the statute. Because it's quite evident from the legislative history in Louisiana that however it was done made large numbers of people believe that they were being indoctrinated against their own religion. Now, I actually see some people shaking their heads. The point here isn't whether that's true or false. The point is that real people sincerely believed that they were being indoctrinated against their religion. Now, there are various ways in which this might be handled, right? But it was handled then by the legislature and handled very badly. Why handled badly? They passed a ham-fisted, prejudiced statute that instead of making the matter better, probably made it worse. The most evident, the tells of this are in those preferences that when Eugene Volokh helpfully presented portions of the statute on the board, things like teachers are protected against being discriminated against for advocating creationism, but not protected for advocating evolution. The funds for providing study guides for one side and not for the other. All of these are tells that indicate that that statute was a very ham-fisted and unfair way of dealing with a very serious problem, nonetheless. Then it gets to the United States Supreme Court, and the court did not do a very good job with the matter either. The court went immediately to the question of purpose, which is a very dubious ground for constitutional decision-making. There are reasons, good reasons, why in every other area of constitutional law we have rejected the idea that bad motives on the part of legislators are a ground for striking down a legislative action. But in the case, not only, even if you don't agree as an abstract doctrinal proposition that the purpose test is misguided, this is the court's opinion is a classic example of why we should be suspicious of the test. Because instead of asking sympathetically what might be the legitimate purposes why representatives of the people in Louisiana might have passed such a statute, the court took a decidedly uncharitable view of their purposes. And again, I just remind you of all of the legitimate purposes that Eugene Volokh put helpfully on the board for us that the court might have noticed. But the most important and the real purpose here was that many people in Louisiana believed that their kids were being indoctrinated. And the legislature wanted to do something about that. Right? Now, what do we usually do? When religious minorities in this country feel that public institutions are abusing them, we don't usually ask, oh, well, is it really so bad? Right? What we usually do is try to work out ways to accomplish educational and other public purposes in a way that diminishes or decreases or reduces the conflict with them. And so, for example, if Jewish parents objected to the choice of The Merchant of Venice in 10th grade English, we wouldn't have any hesitation to say, okay, we'll teach Macbeth instead. Or if Muslim parents objected to having a medieval woodcut portrait of Muhammad in the history textbook, I'm willing to bet that a liberal, and I don't mean that in a political sense, but liberally minded, tolerant people would say, okay, we can accommodate that. We don't have to do that. Think about the way the way in which biology and evolution are regarded in schools around the Navajo reservation. Because the Navajos also have a creation story. But teachers, I spent over 15 years of my life in the state of Utah, and teachers are taught about Navajo creation stories, taught to respect them, and taught how to teach biology in a scientifically valid fashion, but in a way that minimizes the assault on Navajos. Now, I would entitle, if I titled my remarks today, If Fundamentalists Were Navajos. I'd like to ask, what would we do about this controversy if we had the same sensitivity and regard for Christian fundamentalists that we do for Navajos? And I do not think that we would proceed in the way that we've been hearing. I think instead we would see an effort to teach evolution in a scientifically valid way, but acknowledging that there are other valid worldviews. This is, I think, the burden of Kent Greenewald's comment about the limits of science. To recognize the limits of science is important, I think, for science education, but it also has the value of showing respect for other points of view. And in addition to that, it seems to me that we would probably end up with better science education if we took these arguments more seriously. I'm rather interested to hear that around the world more people are finding that they're not persuaded by evolution, and certainly the degree of skepticism about global warming is on the increase rather than the decrease. We might ask, well, why is this? If the evidence for these propositions is so clear, why is it that so many people end up not agreeing with them or disagreeing with them? Might it possibly be because experience shows that when the other side is shut out, that people that become skeptical? They think that they are being indoctrinated rather than being educated. Would it not be a good idea, not under the statute, which I agree was extraordinarily poorly done in Louisiana, but as a matter of educational policy, might it not be a good idea to present the, quote, evidences on both sides of this controversy and invite the students to think through the evidences and the inferences to be drawn from those evidences, and to think about the limits of science, and to talk about this whole issue in a way which is not so one-sided. Now, why don't we do that? I mean, I think that this is because fundamentalists aren't Navajos. I think that fundamentalists are a religious minority that we in the academic elite feel free to feel contempt for. I do think that there's possibly a reason for that, a logical reason for that, because fundamentalists are actually a little bit like communists in the following respect, that we fear, and possibly with good reason, that if they took over, that they would not be as liberal with us as they're asking that we be with them. That's the fundamental problem why persecution of communism was actually logical. But I think the experience with communists and with other groups of this sort is that it is a lot more effective for a liberal society to extend toleration and respect even to those people that we don't agree with and we might be a little bit scared of than it is simply to regard them as groups to be forced to simply give in. These differences in views are not going to go away. Maybe this particular issue will eventually go away. I don't know, but there will be others. And it's so important, I think, to cultivate in a liberal democratic republic the idea that we do not use the public schools to teach one side only. We should understand what religious minorities are saying and to work out ways in which to provide a scientifically valid education in a way which minimizes rather than maximizes the clash perspectives.
Okay. Well, now for something completely different. It is so different that I don't think I would have invited me to be here. And I'm a little concerned that I shouldn't have said yes when I was invited. I'm not going to talk about Edwards. I'm not going to talk about the First Amendment. And I'm not even going to talk about evolution. I'm going to talk about neuroscience. I work, among other areas, on ethical, legal, and social issues arising out of neuroscience. I work with a lot of neuroscientists, and some of them are worried that neuroscience may become the next evolution creationism fight. And whatever they might feel about it, one thing they're pretty confident is they don't want to be in the middle of one of these fights for lots of reasons. And so I want to speculate a little bit on whether it's likely to be or not. Alan Leshner, who is the CEO of the American Association for Advancement of Science, is a neuroscientist and is quite concerned about this. Ultimately, my guess is it won't be, but I suppose I'm here as much out of interest about what you think about it as what I think about it. So the crux of the concern here is that neuroscience will say things about determinism, free will, and the soul that religion will find deeply uncomfortable in ways that some religious traditions may find deeply uncomfortable in ways that may lead to a similar kind of conflict. I think that the creationism evolution conflict has such a deep historical set of roots and contingencies going well to scopes and well beyond that it clearly won't happen in the same way. Is it likely to happen at all? I don't think so, and I think that requires looking at both the scientific and the religious issues and some of the social setting around those three concepts, determinism, free will, and the soul. From a scientific perspective, from a neuroscientist perspective, the key issue here is determinism. Not all, but almost all scientists believe that our minds are determined by physical changes in our brains, and that those changes that you could, if you knew enough, which they don't believe they do and do believe they may never know enough, but if you knew enough, you could tell what the brain state will be at time t1 by knowing what the brain state was at time t0 and what else happened in between. And from knowing that brain state, if you knew enough, you'd be able to deduce the mental state. And that everything, all of our thoughts and actions, in that sense, are determined by the physical state of our brain, which is determined by physical issues in the universe. That, I think, almost all neuroscientists believe. There are a few who will wave their hands and say quantum effects, but quantum effects are the last refuge of a scoundrel in a field like this. Free will, on the other hand, is trickier. Philosophers have thousands of years of experience arguing about free will. I'm not sure philosophers have free will to avoid arguing about free will. And as I understand the denominations of philosophers in this area, there's a broad distinction between the indeterminists and the determinists. But within the determinists, there's an important distinction between the compatibilists and the incompatibilists. The incompatibilists believe that determinism is incompatible with free will. The compatibilists believe that determinism is or free will is compatible with determinism. It's all over my pay grade. I don't have a view on it, but the philosophers disagree in a way that makes me think that although the neuroscientists often, without a lot of thought, believe that lack of free will follows from determinism, that's not necessarily true. On the issue of the soul, I don't think the scientists have very much to say, frankly, other than that, sort of as Laplace said, supposedly in response to Napoleon, I have no need of that hypothesis. There may be a soul, there may not be a soul. The neuroscientists are willing to say that if it is truly an immaterial thing, we can't speak to it. We don't think we need it to explain what we see. But it's not a crucial tenet of neuroscience to say there is no such thing as a soul, whereas it is a fairly crucial tenet of neuroscience to say, for most neuroscientists at least, to say that the mind is determined by the physical brain, which is in turn determined by the state of the universe and physical processes. Now switch to the religious side. I think, although I certainly don't pretend to be a religious scholar, either a religious or a scholar. Well, I sometimes pretend to be a scholar. I think that the important thing for most religious traditions is the soul. Now, what exactly that means in terms of the soul, whether it is an immortal aspect of our personality, character, etc., whether implicit in the idea of the soul is the idea of free will, probably not implicit in the soul is the idea of a non-deterministic universe, if one can be a compatibilist and believe in determinism and free will. I think what the religious side will care about most is the soul, to some extent about free will, less to determinism. So its order of priorities is exactly the opposite of the order of priorities of science. And in fact, there's a lot of religious dispute over the millennia about free will, about the extent to which our futures, our salvation is predestined or not predestined. So I think religion doesn't, at least in Western tradition, necessarily speak with one voice on those issues, making it more confusing, I think, in terms of whether there will be a strong conflict. I'm not even sure where fundamentalism, if we can use that as a category, would fall on the issue of free will versus predeterminism. And I suspect it varies depending on who you're talking with. So I think that the concerns overlap, but the force of the concerns are sort of out of sync with each other in a way that makes me think that you won't get a clear confrontation the way there has been a clear confrontation between evolution and creationism. But I actually think the most important factor is the last one, the social setting. Most of the evolution arguments and fights, at least at the constitutional level, arise from teaching in the public schools. Neuroscience, as far as I can tell, is almost completely not taught in high school. There is some biology, but I surveyed some of my neuroscience and biology friends around the university. As far as they know, even in AP biology, there's very, very little neuroscience taught, if any, and at a very limited level. So it may turn out that Alan Leshner's worries are in vain for no other reason than that not enough neuroscience is taught at the high school level to actually prompt a conflict about this. But I sort of apologize for taking us off in such a completely different direction from everyone else. But and I suspect Alan Leshner, would be very interested in your thoughts about whether neuroscience and religion is headed for the same kind of conflict that evolution and religion has lived through for the last 80 to 100 years.
Thank you. I'm quite glad you're here.
But you have to say that. They don't.
For a variety of reasons. So I would like to open it up now to folks from the audience to ask questions. If you don't mind to move to the mic, just because we're filming and we want to make sure we get the question on film too. But feel free to line up.
Lining up is good.
Yeah.
My comment and question are for Mike. You know, what you said about imagine that fundamentalists are Navajo, I think a vague remark that Molly Ivins, I think people know her, Molly Ivins made about, I think at least 25 or 30 years ago, she was speaking at a conference, and Molly, who's in front of fundamentalist herself, said that this is a group that you could not find a single sympathetic depiction in any mainstream media. And I noticed that. She gave one exception. Well, it wasn't mainstream media. She mentioned one sympathetic novel, which I read with great interest. And I think that continues to be true. Nonetheless, I would still oppose changing the curriculum because of any objection, whether it be from a Navajo or a fundamentalist or an atheist for that matter. And I don't, so I have two-part question for you. And let me just say, my own view is I would be accommodating of the individual, but I would not let the individual's religious objections alter the curriculum if there's a secular scientific basis for the curriculum. And I take it you were not advocating any constitutional claim on the part of fundamentalists. You're not advocating constitutional remedy either under the Establishment Clause or the Free Exercise Clause, but rather you're just saying we should work it out through the political process and through teachers voluntarily being more sympathetic, or were you actually advocating legal remedy.
No, you read me correctly, and I think it would have been helpful if the Supreme Court, instead of writing the opinion that it did, had said something like this. There's a perfectly legitimate and commendable purpose in trying to deal with the problem of teaching evolution in the face of religious objections to it, but this statute is ill-designed for that purpose for all the many reasons that we know. And then, instead of shutting, the problem with this idea of no secular purpose is that it implies that it's actually unconstitutional to think about the problem of religious impact when we're looking at curriculum. And I think that leads to intolerance.
Back and forth.
My background is science, but it's not in the biological sciences, and therefore I'm not terribly qualified, I think, to ask anything very deep. But it does seem to me that if creationism and its later forms made much headway, that science could be subjected to what happened in the Soviet Union under Lysenko. And I'd like to just toss that out.
Yeah, we've talked, a number of people have referred to the limits of science. And, certainly I would say there are definite limitations of science. Science is limited to explaining the natural world, limited to using natural explanations. That leaves a whole lot for religion, philosophy, aesthetics, a lot of things that human beings are interested in. But we also have to think about the strengths of science. And where science has great strength is in explaining the natural world. If you have an explanation for the natural world that is based upon revelation, that is based upon some sort of internal state of your own, you've imagined something, you've had a dream or whatever, I'm sorry, but yours is not going to be as useful or good or valid as that of science, because when it comes to explaining the natural world, sorry, but we win. Okay, which leaves a whole lot of things for other ways of knowing. But the question is, as I was saying in my brief remarks, the question really boils down to, what do you teach in a high school science course? You do not advocate religion. You teach the consensus view of science of that discipline, because high school is limited. You can't teach everything. You really need to teach what scientists agree upon. That said, I agree completely with Mr. McConnell. And on our NCSE website, you'll find lots of examples and suggestions for teachers about how to teach this topic with sensitivity, teach it honestly, and do not compromise the teaching of evolution. Some scientists believe large-scale creatures roamed the world millions of years ago. No, you don't have to. Dinosaurs lived. You can just be real about the science, but you can also teach it in a way that respects the ideological views, as it were, generally those are conservative Christians, and leaves them free to come up with their own conclusions, but you still need to teach the science. And unfortunately, what happens in the history of this controversy is that evolution has been suppressed for ideological reasons. I think this is the sort of thing that Nadine was talking about. And that is both bad social policy as well as very bad constitutional law, because you are advocating specific religious views, giving them priority over others, and that's something that you should avoid.
So I guess one brief comment and the question. The brief comment is just regarding Mitch McConnell's statement about Louisiana in 1980. I think it's actually extremely unlikely that evolution was even being taught in most high schools in Louisiana in 1980. I think that law was probably produced by the culture war and by the fact that there's a fundamentalist movement that had been for decades been pushing against evolution. It's pretty unlikely, I think, that there was a direct thing. There may be a little bit in the record about it, but that's just my suspicion. It should be researched. The bigger question I have is about, we know that creationism has been evolving under legal pressure, precisely because the courts have targeted secular purpose, and then they try and hide it, and then the courts dig it out and bring it up again. And we know this happened, like, even in the Louisiana law, as the Arkansas law was going to trial, They took out the global flood and the age of the earth from the bill in Louisiana. And then the whole argument that Wendell Bird was making was, look, this isn't the bad creation science. This is a good toned-down version. Later on, that turned into intelligent design. Eventually, the history of that got dug up, and that got shot down. And so the question is, what's going to happen in the future? We've heard some about academic freedom bills and things like that, but are we going to see continued evolution in response to legal pressure, or is it going to get to a zone where either everything's so toned down it doesn't matter, or maybe, for example, what's going to happen with the Supreme Court? Is it going to open up a new zone of possibilities for creationism? So that's my question.
Well, I could speculate on what the creationists are going to do next. And what they found with intelligent design, even though the word creationism isn't there, any judge will ask, intelligent design? Oh, who is the designer? There's an agent implied. And once you have an agent implied, that agent is obviously God. You can look at the history of all of these efforts, and it becomes quite clear. So they're going to try to come up with some agentless form of creationism, which will be difficult, but we have our best men working on this. But of course, the evidence against evolution, just denigration of evolution, which in their frame of mind accomplishes the same thing as promotion of creationism, the two-model approach, which is just permeates their literature. It's not difficult to find at all. And that's also the case with intelligent design. When you look at irreducible complexity, okay, that is basically a statement that science can't explain this. Okay, we have irreducibly complex things. Since science can't explain it, therefore, the intelligent designer did it. So it's really just basically the same thing as the two-model approach. Disprove evolution and you have proved creationism. What the courts are going to do is very scary.
One new element that's come in is the extent now to which ID people certainly are trying to link Darwin with Hitler. And this is a big move now. Those of you, what was the movie Expelled?
Expelled.
But it's a very popular one now, that Darwinism is socially pernicious because it led straight to Mein Kampf. And I'd be very interested to see to what extent they can make mischief, the creationists can make mischief with this one. But certainly this is a line now which is, has taken prominence in the last 5 years.
Eugenie, do you mind if I ask a question really quickly? I can understand why some creationists might believe that introducing evidence that shows sort of the weaknesses or the gaps or whatever in evolutionary science might tend to disprove it. I don't understand why evolutionists would think that.
No, we don't.
Okay, so is your organization against laws that simply say something to that effect and not more? And if so, is it just because you assume it's a guise for really doing more than that in the class?
It is, the latter. The evidence against evolution approach, which again comes right out of Scalia's dissent, shown up in the academic freedom laws and any number of other bills, including the Santorum Amendment. We have lots of examples of denigrating evolution as support for creationism. It is a backdoor kind of creationism. As I read you the quote from the Alabama legislator who proposed the first Academic Freedom Act, he was just straight up that this is going to allow teachers to bring in biblical creationism. He didn't even mince words. So, the history of this, these bills don't occur, these aspects of the movement don't occur in a vacuum. There's a long history, and the history does show that this is an effort to advocate a specific sectarian religious view. Now, the reason why they try to hide the advocacy of religion is that is what the Supreme Court or any court will get you on. Ron's felicitous phrase is certainly true. It's not unconstitutional to teach bad science. If you were to just teach that the evidence for evolution is weak, there are gaps in the fossil record. The second law of thermodynamics disproves evolution. Natural selection can't do anything but just mix around genes. It can't produce new body plans. All this kind of stuff was just dumb science. Why would you deliberately teach bad science to a student as well as good science and let the students decide? I mean, that's just, that's just pedagogical malpractice. But this is, you know, taken the most benignly, this is what these laws would recommend. Looking at the history of these laws, they're not just efforts to teach bad science. They're efforts to try to bring creationism into the classroom.
I have a different sense of pedagogy because I think that the best way to teach is to give the students the evidence for one position and the best case for the other position, and then lead them through the process of reasoning to what the right result is. And I wonder really, from the point of view of even advancing your cause, I wonder if you aren't taking the wrong tactic here, that instead of being so defensive about, you know, trying to keep out alternative arguments, why don't you welcome them in the confidence that in a full and a free presentation of both sides, that the right side is likely to come out on top.
I think critical thinking is just great, and that's what you're recommending. That we give students the evidence here, make them evaluate the evidence, see which one is stronger, come up with a conclusion, right? I'm all for that. But why don't we have them do that about things that are actually in contention? Okay? Are dinosaurs warm-blooded or cold-blooded? That's a great exercise for a high school student to debate. Whether evolution occurred or didn't occur is not a great topic for students to debate because it's not something scientists are arguing about.
The reason it's a great topic is it's something in contention at the level of student understanding. That is, it's something that all high school students are aware is a debate. They're actually interested in it. I think that they would like to know, how does an intelligent person think through these things? I hear this at church, I hear this over here, I hear this here. How does one work through problems that involve evidence, inference, presuppositions, how far does it take? And of course, a lot of the evolutionary literature is not squeamish about drawing anti-theistic inferences from their evidence.
Okay.
Well,
trust me on that. High school teachers are not presenting evolution as something that's against
if anyone reads, if a bright high school student is reading Dawkins or Gould or others, they're likely to come across this. And my point is not that. It's just that it seems to me that this fear of debate is not very attractive.
No, it's not fear of debate at all. The question is, what are you going to debate?
But not this.
Actually,
Let's debate something people don't care about, like whether dinosaurs are cold-blooded.
On the other hand, what is your goal? Is your goal to teach students how to critically think about things? In that case, I've actually written an article about this with my colleague Glenn Branch as to how do you pick a topic that's suitable for a high school level critical analysis. And basically, one of the things you want to do is pick for a science class. I mean, if this is a class in, actually some of the best critical thinking instruction is done in English classes, interestingly enough, where they teach you how to recognize propaganda and so forth. But in a science class, how do you pick a topic for a science class that students could exercise critical thinking? One thing you want to pick for a science class is this a topic where the issues really are scientific? Because the topic you're talking about, whether evolution is valid science, whether it's not valid science, whether creation is true, evolution is true, those are not actually scientific topics. Those are topics that are very important to students. There's lots of topics that are very important to students. That doesn't mean that you choose them necessarily for the classroom.
Just one.
We want to move on quick.
Okay, just very quickly. I'm just thinking autobiographically here. My first real science class was in 8th grade. It was a sort of an introduction to chemistry, and I remember very little of it, but I do remember one thing from it, which is that in the first chapter they introduced the demon theory, and so the demon theory is that all these various things that are observable are caused by little invisible demons. And at every point during the book, we would learn the chemistry, and we would also be asked the question about the demon theory. And The point of the demon theory was not that there's no scientific debate over whether they're demons. The point is that it helps you to understand what kinds of questions are scientific questions and what kinds of questions aren't, and what are the limits of evidence and so forth.
Let's move on. I believe you're next. Thank you.
This is a question probably for somebody in history of science or philosophy of science, right? First of all, it's very depressing for me to hear this. If you look at what happened, how we learned stuff, a few hundred years ago, if you teach that the Earth is not flat, that may be controversial, right? A few hundred years ago, if you teach that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, that may be controversial. Today, nobody, think that is controversial, okay? Because we know for a fact that Earth is not flat. Somebody's going to channel Kuhn and say, I don't know that for a fact. But, how did we get from there to today, where those are considered very well-established scientific facts? Now, many of us know that evolution is very well-established scientific facts. So how do we get that to, the modern population? I mean, looking back at history of science and philosophy of science, how did we get from there to here, right? Somehow we got here. So I hope we don't have to wait another 500 years to get there, right? And in another 500 years, maybe neuroscience will be taught in middle school,
It wasn't very hard. It's pretty much just a historical myth that people didn't believe that the Earth was round. Everybody since ancient Greece, except for a handful of Eastern Orthodox people in the early, late antiquity, early medieval period, this got popularized in the early 19th century in a novelistic biography of Columbus by Washington Irving, who thought it would be a little more dramatic if the sailors in Columbus were all worried about going off. I mean, that's just, that's worse than creationism. And since you mentioned the other one about not being in the center of the solar system, nobody felt demoted by that, because in the Aristotelian Ptolemaic system, the center of the cosmos was the sewer pit of the world. Everything good was outside, circling around the Earth. So nobody expressed concern about being demoted until the end of the 17th century, when Newtonian physics took over, and then people kind of extrapolated and said, boy, that was a real demotion back there, but not for the people who lived through it.
There was a big conflict about the establishment of the sun as the center of the solar system. You probably have heard of Galileo.
Never heard of the guy.
Well, Cardinal Bellarmine certainly thought that the sun was the center of the solar system.
Oh, yeah, but I'm saying nobody thought that giving up a position in the center was a demotion. Going out was a wonderful thing.
But Yao-Man's question is, I think, very valid. How is it that views within science become commonplace? I mean, nobody's really fussing about this at this point.
Even the most fundamentalists, they read the Bible literally today. They can still come up with interpretation of the four corners of the earth.
Right.
Actually, there's some neo-geocentrists, but that's...
I think that it's all to do with humans. You look at the controversy after Darwin, and although Darwin has only that one very short, throwaway paragraph in the Origin, as soon as he had published, everybody started talking about humans. The Huxley-Wilberforce clash, Huxley's own book, Lyell's book, and I think that if evolution had nothing to do with humans, we wouldn't be having this debate today.
And to back you up, many fundamentalists, including William Jennings Bryan, said if humans were out of this scheme, we wouldn't have any theological objections. He thought it was a little preposterous, but time and again, you can read leading fundamentalists saying, if it's just applied to plants and animals, that's just fine.
Please.
All right.
Whoever's nicest, please.
Thanks. I'd like to offer a speculation on whether the findings of neuroscience are going to stir a similar conflict as the findings of evolutionary biology. I think there will be, and probably already are, theologists that find this a problem. But in order to become such a big conflict, more must happen. And I think this pretty much matches what Professor Ruse already said, that evolution is, for the creationists, a much bigger social issue. I mean, there are books issued by the Institute for Creation Research that analyze different TV series on whether the word evolution appears there. And they find this grand scheme of, secular humanists infiltrating society and so on. So the question would be if the findings of neuroscience are also prone to being applied in such a broad sense, to be applied in other fields of literature and so on and so forth. And I would assume that this is not the case.
That's helpful and interesting. I think one area where I think, unfortunately, there are people who want to make it the case is to import too strongly some neuroscience ideas into the criminal justice system. There are neuroscientists who take the position that that neuroscience proves there's no free will. If there's no free will, the guy who mugged you didn't have a choice, therefore we shouldn't punish him. I don't know any lawyers who take that position. I don't think it will actually have a lot of traction, but that is one area where it might sneak into a broader cultural discussion.
Please.
Thanks for this fascinating conversation. I'm curious about the role of identity on conversation about science in the courts. I'm struck by the role of fundamentalist identity vis-a-vis these questions. I'm struck by the role of American identity, Russian identity, Navajo identity as influencing potentially scientific discourse. And I think this richness and variety of identity questions can add to even science about neurobiology or neuroscience in interesting ways. I think people see things in different ways and can come to different conclusions, different experiments about the natural world. I'm curious about how the feedback loop might work the other way, science on identity, and this plays out in the courts as well. How perhaps you, Hank, might explore those questions of how questions of neuroscience might influence American fundamentalism, or even ideas of what it is to be American in the courts, for example, in a broader sense than just fundamentalism.
I have to think about it. Maybe. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a comment for Professor McConnell and a question perhaps for Professor Greely. Well, I think you raise a good point about the double standard, perhaps, of Navajo and Christian fundamentalist treatment. I don't agree with your examples that it's relevant to discuss Muhammad artworks or Substitute in the Merchant of Venice, because those are humanities, social science classes. They're not science classes. A substitute for evolution would not be creationism. So it's a different discipline, which you can comment on, of course. But my question for Professor Greely is, what do you think as a sort of counterweight to the idea of insisting that determinism should be taught in social science and history classrooms?
As to the first question, science, from a constitutional point of view, science is no different from any other subject. The question is whether it is an unconstitutional purpose for a legislature to observe the religious groups within the society are feeling oppressed by what's going on by public institutions, and to try to do something to reduce that. And I think the answer to that is no. Edwards, to the contrary, notwithstanding.
And I'll take a shot at your question with a clarifying question of my own. When you say determinism should be taught in history classrooms or social science classrooms, historical determinism or this idea of neurodeterminism?
No, yeah, this idea of neurodeterminism, because even there's a lot of discussion of agency within social sciences, and so I was wondering if you would think that you could make a similar debate about the appropriate or inappropriateness of introducing ideas like neuropsychology into discussing agency within the social sciences.
You must be a philosopher.
I don't think so, but again, I mean, this, 2 in a row, I have to say I don't know, I have to think about it. I knew I shouldn't have been on this panel.
I'll ask you again maybe after a couple glasses of wine.
I just wanted to add a comment about the Navajos here. For years, I've been pointing out the lack of symmetry between the way that fundamentalist Christians and Navajos are treated, and even the new museum on the mall now has the Navajo theory of, or story of creation, and I don't see the National Center for Science Education going after it. You should probably. But when I raise this with friends of mine, here's what they tell me, is that there's a fundamental difference. That the Navajos aren't trying to force it down anybody's throat, whereas those pesky fundamentalists are trying to pass laws forcing their view down, and so we can tolerate the Navajos, but we can't tolerate the fundamentalists.
It has to do with religious advocacy.
But
That's the issue.
can I just pick up on your question? Surely any science, including any social science, is going to make some kind of assumption about determinism. I mean, if you like, it seems to me equivalent to methodological naturalism, but you can still say, but although I'm a methodological naturalist, I'm not necessarily a metaphysical one. And it would seem to me that if you're going to do, let's say, sociology, free will is probably not going to be an issue that you're going to deal with, because what you're going to try to show is how people behave under certain things. Now, whether or not you feel this, when you've finished, is an entirely adequate and full explanation, I think is another philosophical question. So my personal feeling is, I don't see how you could do science without, at some level, assuming some level of determinism. But you'd say, this is my assumption that I go in with.
But that's actually helped me say something other than I don't know and I need to think about it, which is, I think some people will try to teach it in social sciences and so on, but I think the gap between the explanatory level and power of that and actual human cultures and behaviors is so great that it's unlikely to get much traction. Either usefully in terms of advancing the particular field or in terms of creating much controversy.
Thank you.
Can we do the last two very quickly? Is that possible? I don't want to rush you too much. But
The answers are longer than the questions.
I'm talking to you guys over here. So yeah, please.
Oh, so you're talking to them, not us.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries. All right, so I will try to keep this brief then, because I do have a question/comment stemming from Hank's remark, as well as, and I would love to comment following this discussion between Jeannie and Michael. So regarding this question about free will and determinism, this unavoidably interfaces with this aspect of worldview that Michael Ruse was discussing, and in debating creationists for the last decade, this is at the forefront of everything as well. But as far as evolution, what evolution might have to say about free will, there's a great quote from Genetic Gods by John Avis, which is that our evolutionary heritage channels and sets flexible boundaries on human thought and action, such that by definition, no exercise of will can truly be free. It's not detached from any other pre-existing biases, whether at the ultimate level for evolution or the proximate level in terms of neurobiology. But knowing Robert Sapolsky's class in neurobiology that he teaches here, and seeing that Stanford undergraduates even struggle to understand the relationship between the information in that class and whether they do or do not have free will, I have to say I really am not all that concerned with it. And then a quick comment with Jeannie and Michael. Honestly, I would love to see, as Michael's alluding to, this creation evolution discussion as you articulated it, more frequent in college classrooms. before starting college and being in high school, I took classes at a community college where it was. And you would take tests. There'd be a question about, say, Archaeopteryx, a early bird relative. How is this evidence for evolution? How is this evidence against creation? And those are themes that were taken throughout the entirety of the class. But the problem, I think, ultimately is that, especially in high school and even in professional circles, and I say this as an evolutionary biologist, I think too many people are too inadequately trained. They're not well-rounded enough to be able to articulate the discipline clearly for students to be able to understand it well enough so that students are not misinformed and the information itself is not misrepresented. So in that sense, I have to say that in principle, I would love to see that in practice. I have to say I definitely think that the current strategy within CSC is possibly better.
Well, one thing to add to your contemplation of this issue, everybody's contemplation, survey research has shown that the amount of time that a high school biology teacher in a biology class actually spends on the topic of evolution is just about minuscule. I mean, it is something like a couple of hours a semester, and we are fussing like this as if this is, we would like to see evolution be treated like cells, and run all the way through the course, but that doesn't happen. It's this little piece that they tack on at the end if they get around to it after spending time memorizing the enzymes for photosynthesis or something. They're not really doing what's important. But yeah, I mean, in theory, it would be wonderful to take 3 or 4 weeks and go through all the evidence for evolution. What are the creationist complaints about this? How do you evaluate but then what else do you leave out? I mean, they're not spending enough time on evolution from the get-go.
Don't always, though, pray for what you want. My kids came home believing in punctuated equilibrium.
I'll give you one more.
So I have a question that sort of combines human behavior with sociological and financial things, right? So the first observation is people probably familiar with Richard Feynman's quote about not being certain about anything, having some things he was really pretty sure of, but never completely certain. My observation is that that's kind of a worldview you find among scientists, but it's absolutely terrifying to a lot of people, right? The idea that there is uncertainty is really, really hard for a lot of people, right? And that's a thing we're always fighting upstream against. The broader concern is the evolution creationism thing is just one instance of a combined set of factors that are increasing basically the attempt to create doubt for science. And that's part of the issue with the high school thing, is it's an asymmetric debate. It's much easier to create doubt and confusion than clarity. Right? So, for instance, we've had the long-term creationist stuff with a clear religious motive. Then the tobacco guys came along and created a whole lot of modern anti-science, starting with John Hill back in 1954 to create doubt, right? I mean, the issue there was not to disprove the science, it was to create doubt. It worked very well. And then they created a machine that got picked up in anti-environmental things. Certainly the whole anti-global warming stuff is completely inherited from that. So you got folks like the Heartland Institute pouring stuff into K through 12, or trying, right? So the question is what do we do over the long term to keep, to get that sense of what things are known, where are the limits, but you've got to know the difference between something that's really pretty solid and something that, is still on the edge. I mean, what do we do? I mean, we have a civilization that utterly depends on scientific thinking. Right? And what do we do to let room for opinions, but make sure that the students know, what they need to know?
Just very brief.
Don't expect the schools to solve all the problems. This is an overall cultural factor, or a cultural problem. The fact that the sports team gets off on Friday afternoon to go to its, gets release time from school to go to its activity, but the debate team doesn't. The science fair doesn't give nearly as much attention as the, pep rally. You know, we have all kinds of cultural themes in our society which do not value science. Yes, we need better science teaching. We need more inquiry learning, less just rote repetition. We need more, as you were saying, and I agree completely, more about how science works, its limitations as well as its advantages. We need a great deal of improvement in science education, no question about it. But that's only going to be part of it. We need to value science more. And that's going to be a mass medium phenomenon more so than an educational phenomenon, believe it or not.
Thank you so much. We're going to, if we give them a hand. We're going to go straight to the concluding remarks by Ed Larson, please. And following that, though, there's a reception which we can direct you to.
Well, we're already over, so I don't want to take very long. I'm going to make just a couple comments. But before I do, I most of all want to thank Nathan, who put this whole thing together. Got everybody here. Did so on behalf of the Stanford Constitutional Law Center, of which Michael McConnell is the director, and so ultimately the responsibility for even Nathan being here and for everything goes back to Michael. So, beyond that, I've known this whole school operates because it's got a remarkable dean. Larry Kramer is just an amazing dean. He's not here today, but he keeps everything going, or at least will until he steps down at the end of this year.
We have to hope it keeps going even after Larry.
And so I want to acknowledge him too. I want to thank all of you for coming. I do want to say, just quickly, that we've heard a lot of things today that could be described as, in the last exchange, really captured, that there's increasing doubt in some way about science, or there's science bashing going on, that the fundamentalists are out attacking science, or popular book recently, The Republican War on Science. And you know, we're in a period of increasing distrust of certain institutions in America. But polls show that doesn't really amazingly apply to science. And maybe that's why these issues are so important. Because science has actually, the polls show, is gaining increasing acceptance. A recent poll by the Pew, a massive poll by the Pew Institute, found that, I've just got the numbers here, 84% of Americans report that science effect on society is mostly positive. 85%. It's a remarkable figure. You don't get that with other fields. And that 7 out of 10 Americans say that science contributes a lot to society's well-being. Now, you don't find that with Harvard. There's a group of institutions that stand up there at that level in this survey. The military, teachers, engineers, doctors, and scientists. That's where they come out in this survey. You drop down half that high, and you get to the clergy, journalists. And then way down low, at about 20% or less, you get politicians, and yes, you get lawyers. They're contributing a lot to society. Now business executives are down in that same level, but scientists are up there with these other top groups. The survey found that the public, when asked, what is the greatest contribution to America? What is America's greatest contribution over the last 50 years? Every time that question has been asked, it's science, technology, and medicine that tops the chart. And it still does in the most recent surveys. So we should remember that. And one final interesting survey that comes out of this, while most Americans of every group believe there is a war between science and religion, most of them don't believe there is a war between science and their religion. And it doesn't matter what group you ask. Republicans? No, there's not a war. Democrats? No, there's not a war. Protestants? No, there's not a war between science and my religion. Even, amazingly, even creationists do not report that there's a war between science and their religion. So there is, despite all this, an incredible position that religion has that I don't think is carried by the other divisions in school. I don't think people view that way about history or society. So when we're thinking about these issues, we have to bring this into context. Well, I appreciate all of the speakers who were here today bringing it into context, and I welcome you all to a reception where people can ask more questions of these folks. Thank you.